seller's response to the contract once they do make that response. There are actually two extremes. There are a number of in-betweens, but let's talk about the two extremes. And that would be one, passive. The more passive a seller is, the less motivation there is. The more passive the response, the less the seller is motivated to sell. Example, seller says, I don't want that. I told you, bring me $400,000. I don't want $399. They have no motivation whatsoever. Now, there's only one way to handle a passive seller. And the only way to handle a passive seller is by logic. By showing them logically why it is in their best interest to accept this contract. Now, I want you to please understand something throughout this entire presentation. Everything that I'm saying is based on one premise and one premise only. And that is that this is an offer that is in the best interests of the seller. If I had an offer where listed property is listed at $400 and it's worth $370 and I get a $200,000 offer, I'm probably going to walk in and say, here's another one you're not going to like. But if I've got an offer that's $372,000 and I know the market is $370, even though it's listed at $400, I'm going to fight tooth and nail to get this offer accepted. And I'm going to use every single tactic I can think of, every negotiating tool I have in my basket. But it's in the best interest of the seller. So that's the reason that I'm doing this. You have to do it. If it isn't in the best interest of the seller, you're not going to use any of this. Now let's go to the other extreme, and that is emotional. I had a young lady that presented a contract, and because the family had children and they were some teenagers, and they were in the house with other teenagers from around the neighborhood with music playing, they decided to go out and sit by the pool patio. And they were sitting under an umbrella table, and she passed the contracts to the husband and wife, and she did the two things first. And husband is the one that was going to make the decision. So she looked into his eyes as he's looking at her contract. She's looking over it, and she watched the husband, and he zeroes in on the price, and he goes absolutely ballistic. So ballistic, so irritated and agitated that he grabbed the contract, crumpled it up, starts screaming at this young girl, starts swearing at her, and literally slams this contract into the table so hard that he shattered the table. The wife starts screaming at the husband, jumps out of her chair, crying, runs into the house. Now, if you were sitting in that chair, what would you want to do? Answer, leave. Get out of there. But as I'm leaving, the seller is saying, well, don't come back until you bring me what I want. This young girl got up out of her chair. She had a skirt on. She shook her skirt out, got the glass out of her skirt. She took the chair, tipped it over, slightly tapped it to get the glass out of the chair, and then she sat back down and very, very demurely looked up at the seller and never said a word. What do you think the seller did? First of all, he had to apologize, and he signed the contract. He had to sign the contract. He knew that. Have you ever heard of the term, the rock and the hard place? By that I mean they're caught between two things, two immovable objects, a rock and a hard place. Well, that's the seller. The rock, I've got to sell. I have no choice. I've got to sell. The hard place is, this is not what I want. So they're caught. So what does emotion actually mean? Emotion means the opposite of passive. The more emotional the seller becomes, the more motivation there is. Which of the two do you want? Of course, you want the emotional, but you see, the emotion erupts, and the tendency is to take it personally. One of the hardest things you'll ever find yourself having to do is to remain calm in an emotional situation. You have to understand they're not mad at you. They're mad at the circumstances they find themselves in. So you have to stay calm. That's the only way to handle the emotional response. Now let's get to the final aspect of presenting a contract, and that is negotiating. Negotiating is an art, I guarantee you. And it is an art that we in the Western world do not know. Very few people in the Western world know how to truly negotiate. I mean, how many of you would go to your local grocery store, you buy a loaf of bread, I don't know what it costs, say $2, and you go up to the checkout stand and you say, I'll give you $1.67. I mean, you wouldn't do that. That's absurd. But I guarantee you, absolutely guarantee you, on the other side of this earth, there is a little boy about 4 feet high who has just been given a bunch of coins by his parents, told to go to the local market and buy a loaf of bread. And that kid is going to negotiate every coin in his hand. because he has been trained to do it. This is something that you have to learn. It's an art. It really is. But whenever you get into a negotiating situation, it must be a win-win situation. By that I mean both parties must feel at the end of this that both of them have won. They both have to feel that they've won. Now, one way to do this is what is called boot. And boot means anything other than money that's used to salvage the sale. It's not money. And by the way, boot is never your commission. It's never a concession of your commission. I have seen people pay unbelievable amounts of money, for items that were worth far less. $10,000 for a refrigerator. Just to be able to say, I won, to save face. I'll give you a personal example. My wife and I bought a house about 5 years ago, and we had children, grandchildren that were growing up, and we needed more space. And so we found this house, and the minute we walked in, we knew we were going to buy it. But you have to understand that the house itself, when you walk into it, the first room you walk into has 900 square feet. So we were coming from a condo that only had 1,200 square feet total. We didn't have any furniture. I made a very, very low offer. Now, she was asking a price that was a fair price, but I lowballed the offer. She came back and countered at $25,000 more than I offered. So even giving her the $25,000 was still a good offer. And so in turn, I countered back. I said, I'll give you the $25,000 if you will leave the horseshoe-type couch that's in the living room. I could have bought that couch for $2,000. Why did I pay $25,000 for it? I'm no different than anybody else. I had to win. Win-win situation. And boot doesn't have to be money. It could be the fact that, and this is not a good thing to do, but it could be that the seller allows the buyer to move in before closing, or it could be that the seller allows the buyer to stay after closing until the next closing on their house takes place. But boot is something that will allow them both to feel as though they have won. The next one is reverse empathy, and that just is to make the seller feel like a buyer. Mr. Seller, think back for just a moment to when you purchased this property. When you bought this home, did you know what other homes were selling for? Or did you simply pay whatever the seller wanted? Now, whether they say that verbally or not, you're forcing them to recognize the fact that they did know what other homes are selling for. So reverse empathy, and this works equally well, by the way, with a buyer when you're trying to get an offer back from the buyer to counter. So reverse empathy, make the buyer feel like a seller, make the seller feel like a buyer. The next one is a gambling analogy related to the sale to a game of poker. Suppose for a moment that there's $50 in the pot, but in order to win the 50, you're going to have to bet 350. Well, nobody in their right mind would do that. I mean, that's a ridiculous bet. But the seller's house is worth 350. He thinks it's worth 400. The market value shows 350. The seller has in their hand right now a document that if they sign it, they will get $350,000. That's their money. They are willing to gamble $350,000 of their money against a potential profit of $50,000. That is not a good bet. The fourth one to write down or to look at is stock market analogy, and that is to relate the sale to the sale of stocks. If you were to say to a seller, Mr. Seller, for just a moment, let's suppose I was your stockbroker, and you called me and said, I want to sell 100 shares of my copper stock. I said, well, let's look and see what the price is today. Here it is, $14.75 per share. But wait a minute. You say, I paid $22.50 for those shares. Well, as your stockbroker, I'm going to make one statement and then give you two options. First of all, the statement, I'm sorry, but that's the market today. And the two options, one, sell at $14.75, or two, hold and wait to see if the market goes up. And that's exactly what I would say to a seller. If they want a price that is so much over market, I would tell them to take the property off the market. First of all, I probably would not have taken the listing. The last one I want to give to you is the Ben Franklin close. Ben Franklin was a genius. He really was. I've read a lot about him. But one of the things that I found about him is he did something. Every time he had to make a decision, he would develop a list of pros and cons. And he actually did it. He called it his T list. He wrote a T on a piece of paper. And beneath each side of the T, he would write the pros and cons of doing it. Whichever side outweighed the other, that's the decision he made. And you can do that with the seller. What are the pros of accepting the offer? What are the cons? And go through everything. But with the Ben Franklin close, it is important that you know what they are in advance so that you don't have to think about it. You know them. You have it right there, right? Now, the last thing I want to cover is counteroffers, when and when they should not be used. First of all, when they should not be used. Don't use a counteroffer as a means of escape. What I mean by that is to use a counteroffer simply to extricate yourself from an unpleasant situation, to justify why you don't have to negotiate, why you can just give up, so to speak. Do you remember last week when we talked about the listing presentation, I said that the seller is interviewing you on a lot of levels? Well, one of those levels is your negotiating skills. And if you give up, if you just cave in here, and you say, the seller says, well, I can't take that, and you say to the seller, well, what will you take? You just caved in. And now all of a sudden the seller is thinking, what are you going to do with a buyer? Do the same thing? So don't use a counteroffer as a means of escape. The way you should use a counteroffer is a means of keeping the sale alive.